This talk introduces the first of our case studies. We'll have lots of case studies through the semester, but we've kind of been warming up, getting the kind of big picture of creative problem solving. And now we're able to sort of step in and look at, okay, how has that worked? And what can we learn from that case study? And at the beginning here, we're going to be looking at cultures, case study of cultures that deal with creative problem solving in different ways, and successful or unsuccessful. And then we'll morph into more individuals as case studies. But today, we're going to be looking at 3 of our 10 terms quite explicitly and seeing how they play out. One of those 10 terms is problem solving. And remember that we're talking about this as a problem that involves doubt, uncertainty, and difficulty, and that we're only looking to solve it by answering it or explaining it. Another of the 10 terms we're going to be looking at, and implicit in that problem solving, big important aspect of it for today is, how do we discover problems, or how do they find you? We talked about that as one of the characteristics of problem solving. Sometimes you self-define, sometimes it's given to you. So how do you discover the problems, or how do they find you? Then another of the 10 terms we're going to be looking at is design. And in this case, we're looking at, how does somebody sort of find a plan or a structure for accomplishing this problem? How do you outline it, sketch it, form it, find intentions? How does that work or fail to work? And the third of the 10 terms we're going to be looking at is vision. Can you see into the future? Can you imagine what's going to happen? And can you plan for that kind of scenario? Are you a visionary? Okay, we're looking at problem solving, design, and vision. We're going to be looking at it in the context of a case study that's very well fleshed out by the author Jared Diamond in his book Collapse. And we're going to be looking primarily at environmental problem solving. That book is about many, many case studies of cultures or societies that dealt successfully with environmental problem solving or unsuccessfully. And actually today we're going to be looking at an unsuccessful situation. I think it's good to see what it looks like when we fail to do problem solving. And then we'll be looking in subsequent talks at more successful environmental problem solving. So there are 8 problems or processes through which past societies undermine themselves in terms of degrading the environment to the point that the environment doesn't support them anymore. And these are kind of true across the board. So deforestation, horrible thing that creates environmental problems. Soil degradation, so they can't do their farming anymore. Water management problems, they have a limited water supply and they don't manage it well. Overhunting of animal resources they use for food, or overfishing, same thing. Effects of introduced species, sometimes bringing in species that deteriorate the environment. Maybe population growth beyond what the environment can support, or increased per capita impact of people, meaning that you don't necessarily increase the number of people, but you increase the consumer character of all of those people. So these are 8 problems that often cause environmental distress. And we're going to be looking at Easter Island, this island in the Pacific, and the absence of environmental problem solving. What happened when they didn't solve those problems, and why might they have done that? And what happens when you don't address problems? This is in that realm of, how do you identify problems you want to solve? And in this case, maybe they didn't do such a good job of that. So on Easter Island, they were in a vulnerable ecosystem. It was very hospitable, it was a good place to live, but it had some delicate characteristics. So there were some very good traits of that area. It was very heavily forested when civilization came there, and the forest was a great resource. There was very gently sloping terrain, not steep mountains and not so flat that it didn't drain properly. Very good for agriculture. It had very fertile volcanic soil. It had originally been volcanoes, and the minerals that are in volcanic soil are very good for agriculture. Relatively mild temperatures. During the cold seasons, it was 30 to 60 degrees, hardly ever had a really hard freeze. And in more summer seasons, it usually was 60 to 90 degrees, never got terribly, terribly hot. So a very temperate season, and again, good for growing things as well. There were abundant seabirds and land birds. So there were land birds that roosted in the trees that were there, and they were a good source of food. And there were also seabirds who would periodically come and make a nest there on the island. And they, again, were a source of food, both for eggs and for meat as well. There was abundant fish offshore. The fish right around the island, there were reefs, and there really were not very good fish for eating immediately around the island. But if you made a boat and you went out a little bit, there were tuna and porpoises that were out there, very, very good for eating. So there was a good supply of fish, but not on the coastline. And then there also were abundant stone for both building houses and structures, but also for making tools, and you'll see later also for making these big sculptures that they were very fond of on Easter Island. So that's the ecosystem they were a part of. There were some problematic traits in the ecosystem that was there in terms of human habitation. There was a limited water supply. Of course, there was plenty of salt water, but limited fresh water supply, and relatively low rainfall in that area. There also were very high winds, which meant that you were vulnerable to the topsoil blowing away if it wasn't covered properly, and also just sometimes would knock plants down, even knock animals and people down. Had a relatively short growing season, although it didn't get hard freeze in the winter. It wasn't a particularly good growing season in the winter. It was very remote. There were no other islands around to communicate with. And there was also two things that had to do with its position in the Pacific. Two things that are great about Pacific Islands is they often have aerial ash fallout from volcanoes in other parts of the Pacific, but that was very limited here on Easter Island. Also, many of these islands benefit from the Central Asia dust plume, which comes over the Pacific and drops very fertile, high mineral soil in those areas. But the Easter Island's a long way from Asia, and so it didn't really get much benefit from that. And then the island itself was just relatively small. It couldn't support a large number of people. So there were some problematic traits. These 8 things that I identified, they pretty much screwed up all 8 of those. They made mistakes in every single one of them. And we're not going to talk about all of those, but we are going to start with this notion of deforestation. So that was a very, very big problem they created. They started with an island full of trees. It was really great. But then they had a lot of use for those trees. And they used them for heating and firewood. Of course, if it gets to be 30 degrees at night, you need a little warmth, and they were using that as fuel and firewood. Their religion required cremation. And so their cremation ceremonies were very important to them. And cremation requires a very, very hot fire. And it took a lot of fuel to do that cremation process. So that was eating up a lot of the forest. They also, because they were trying to get these tuna and porpoises that were out a little from the island, they built these very elaborate boats. And those boats were made of timber. So they were depleting the forest to build their boats, not just the timbers for the boats, but also they lashed them together with ropes, and that was coming out of fiber they got from the trees. Sometimes they were cutting down trees just to clear for agriculture because they were a farming community. They also, in their making these statues, they use the timber and the ropes, often to transport the stones. The stones were huge and heavy, and so they would often use a log as a rolling device to transport the stones, and sometimes for hoisting and things like that as well. Then also they did have introduced species. They had rats that came in with them, with the human beings, and those rats would gnaw on the seeds and the fruit of the tree and make it so that it wouldn't germinate. And so new trees were not popping up because the rats were screwing up the seeds and what would have germinated a new tree. So they had terrible deforestation problems. And eventually, all the trees were gone. And you imagine them cutting down the last tree, and then somebody didn't say, holy moly, why, are we sure we want to do this? But yeah, they just kept using them and using them and using them until they were all gone. And of course, that caused terrible, terrible problems. It eventually led to their collapse because the deforestation meant that there was then habitat destruction. So the land birds and the seabirds couldn't roost in those trees anymore, and eventually the land birds, disappeared because there was no habitat for them. The seabirds went to some other island to nest and to, make their next generation. So that habitat destruction was really, really severe, and it was a loss of a lot of food. They also, when the trees were gone, they couldn't build their boats anymore. If they couldn't build their boats, they couldn't go out and get those tuna and porpoises. So another food supply was lost by the loss of the forest. There were fruits on those trees. They were gone now, so one agricultural product of the fruits was no longer available to eat. Then also, the roots of the trees had been stabilizing the soil. And I said there was really high wind here. So when the trees were gone, the root system wasn't there to stabilize the soil, and you began to get erosion of the soil that came. A big rain would come and wash away the topsoil because the root system wasn't there to hold it in place. There also was soil degradation. The trees would drop leaves. The leaves would create mulch. The mulch would then fertilize the soil. But when the trees were gone, there was no enrichment, and they got soil degradation. There were reduced nutrients in the soil because the shade of the trees kept the sun from bleaching the nutrients from the soil. And when the trees were gone, there was degradation of the nutrients from the sun. All of that meant that their food supply, the birds, the fish, were greatly diminished. Their agricultural supply, the fruits from the trees, the farming, because of the soil degradation and the lower nutrients, they were less productive. And suddenly the 15,000 people that lived on the island could no longer get a food supply. And so they began to starve. And then the people began to get aggressive with each other because of this fight for limited resources. And they began to have cannibalism. Their government, which had been a very stable structure, began to be overthrown. And eventually they were invaded by other people, and the whole society collapsed. So in a period of about 300 years, they went from having a population of 15,000 to a population of 111 when they finally were invaded and taken over. So this is a horrible environmental story. This is the absence of solving those problems, and in the absence of that, the entire society collapsed. Now, the interesting thing is that it isn't that these people were stupid or that they were incapable of creative problem solving. They did solve problems in some other ways. So, for example, their agriculture was very, very innovative. They did what they called lithic mulch farming, which is usually you take all the rocks out of your field to farm it, but they actually put rocks in the field, and it did a number of things. For one thing, it cast a shadow so that there would be less degradation of the soil from the sun. It also stabilized the temperature. The rocks would heat up during the day, and it extended their growing season by then re-radiating heat at night, so it wouldn't be 30 degrees. It might only be 45 degrees at the soil level there where the plants were growing. It also held moisture and in the rocks because they're porous, and then it could seep out to the soil over time. So there were also minerals in those rocks that were leaching into the soil and making it more fertile. So they figured all that out and had this very interesting kind of agriculture. They also managed their animals rather cleverly. This is one of their stone chicken huts, and there were like 1,100 of these chicken huts on the island. And some of them would be like 100 feet long, and they're about 6 feet tall and about 12 feet wide, and they're made out of the stone that's there. And this would be where their chickens lived. It would keep the chickens away from the predators, protected from the predators. You can see that tiny little hole at the bottom where the little chicken would go in, and then they'd be safe from the predator. It also would keep them warm at night because that rock would heat up during the day and keep them cozy and warm when it got cold at night. So, you know, they built this very clever chicken coop, and it performed beautifully. So they were capable of creative problem solving. They also, because it was super windy, sometimes they planted their plants in these little concavities in the earth, and that helped the plants grow much better. And they would not be knocked over by the wind when they were little saplings. And then as they got bigger, they could withstand the wind. So it worked perfectly. These were little windbreaks. And then another way they were very creative is in making these statues. Today, we've identified 887 of these statues that they built. An average one is 13 feet tall and weighs about 10 tons, so they're huge. This one would have been made of several different kinds of stone that would have come from different parts of the island. So that's one color of stone from one part of the island, different color of stone for the headdress from another part of the island, different stone for the whites of the eyes and a different stone for the reds of the eyes. So they're cooperating with each other and getting stones from different areas, transporting them, and they're massive. There's some of these. The largest one that's still erect is 32 feet tall and weighs 75 tons. I just can't imagine how they transported this thing and got it erect. There's some that are in the quarry that are not upright that were 70 feet tall and weighed 270 tons. So massive, massive constructions they were making for these sculptures. And then they put these sculptures on big platforms. And the platforms could be as much as 500 feet long. And sometimes there were like 25 of these statues on one of those platforms. The platforms in themselves were quite a construction feat. So they're clearly very, very capable of creative problem solving. And yet, when it came to environmental issues, they didn't solve those problems. So how is it that we decide what problems we want to solve? And how is it that the Easter Islanders made the choices they did? And it maybe calls into question what we're doing today as regards environmental problems. We're certainly capable of doing creative problem solving. We make amazing cell phones that do everything else besides being just a telephone. We send rocket ships into space. We can do all those kinds of things. But those are problems we've chosen to solve. But are we kind of like the Easter Islanders maybe not addressing some of the environmental problems that are staring us in the face, but we haven't chosen to solve some of those problems of climate change or sustainability. How do we make those decisions? Why do we make decisions sometimes not to solve problems that are right in front of our face? Now, you could say the Eastern Islanders made some intelligent decisions. They made those badass sculptures, and here, centuries later, we're looking at them. We're fascinated by these people on Easter Island. They've gotten a kind of immortality. If they just survived, not collapsed, but survived, but never produced these mammoth pieces of art, would we even know the Easter Islanders these days? Did they make those choices intentionally? What was going on? Why are we making the choices we're making? So the real question in this talk is, how do we decide what problems we want to solve? And then why is it that we leave some problems unsolved? And how does that create maybe a failure of a sort that's in some cases kind of unacceptable? So again, we'll talk about this in our check-in. Think about it and be ready to try to figure out how we make environmental decisions about problems today. See you later.